Hello. Why don't you take a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem? Welcome to another exciting new episode of Consult the Doctor. And let's get straight into the game. Cut to the chase, into the game. Play ball. Whatever. I can't choose between a fine nib and a broad nib. If I use one for one day, then I miss the other. Do I have a ferocious disease? Yes. Next question. No, I'm just kidding. Here's what I would say. I can go on for a very long time about this. So here's, I think, my shortest answer. Different nibs have different places. If you have to fill out a form and it is fountain pen friendly paper and you can do that with a fountain pen, a triple broad nib is probably not the best option, but a fine nib or an extra fine nib would be. So I think the reality is, and I'm quite sure I've said this before, I would consider nibs to be tools, and you adjust the tool to the job you're trying to do. That's why I like to have a couple of different nibs. I have fine nibs, I have broad nibs, I have an italic nib, I have an architect nib, and they are used for different things. And I really think that's the simplest way, forgive me, that's the simplest way to do things, right? You have different nibs for different reasons, and if you really want to get the best of maybe not all worlds, but both worlds, buy a really nice, fat, broad nib and have a nibmeister grind that into an architect. And then depending on the angle you have, you can use a finer nib, you can use a broader nib. And then you have everything. And I love doing that. I have one architect nib ground by Salmon from Toronto Pen Company, and it's a great nib. It's really pleasant and it can do just that, and it's really nice. And Salmon can even grind it in such a way that you have a fine nib if you turn the pen upside down. So I'm just saying, then you have everything you need. I hope that's a bit of an answer. I know that was somewhat tongue-in-cheek as a question, but it is a good question. Okay, so next question then. How, I'm abbreviating this a little bit, but how do I get a private ink, and what about the name? Because person who asked this, his last name is also Brown, but he doesn't necessarily want that. He was thinking of a blue, so how do you come up with a name? Well, that question is the simplest. You use your imagination, right? In my case, for the B.R.E. Brown ink, which is named the greatest ink of all time by me, that worked because my last name is Brown, so that's no problem. And every time people then ask me, is there also going to be an B.R.E. blue and an B.R.E. red? No, probably not. Probably not, because I don't want to expand my ink empire into all kinds of different inks. I just have one ink. I like that ink. Many people online seem to like that ink. So that's how it will stay. But that was not the question. So pick a name. If blue is what you want to do, then think of something that means something to you and see if you can connect that to blue and then put that in. For example, the sky is the limit. And it's blue. Now, how do you go about getting that private ink? I can very briefly describe the process for me. Some companies will mix any ink for you, but there are companies that say, but then you have to buy 50 liters or 600 bottles or 1,000 bottles or any of these things. That didn't work for me. So initially, without knowing any of this, I just sent an email to Diamine in the UK, and I thought, in all honesty, I thought they're probably not going to respond. They're probably not going to do this for one person. But I got an email back, and I was asked to have a phone call with the director of Diamine, Christine, and we had a very pleasant phone call. And in a nutshell, I mean, I'm going to leave out a bunch of personal detail here, right? But in a nutshell, the Diamine process is this. You contact them like that. You have a conversation. You send them a Pantone color, which is the standardized color system. And you say, for example, I want, I don't know, whatever. This is not a Pantone color. I want this red. And then you go into the Pantone system and you look at whatever color is closest to this, and then it says, I forget what the code is, but let's say it's Pantone #2217, whatever, right? You go to Diamine, you say Pantone #2217. Let's say, okay, Then they mix some ink for you and they send you a sample or a couple of samples. Like, well, actually we came up with 3. That's what happened for the gourmet pens ink. I think it was 2 or 3 or 4, whatever. And for my ink, it was just one sample. I used one sample. This is what we came up with initially. Do you like it? And I had already discussed I would like shading. I want something that's not too difficult to clean. I don't need something that's waterproof. I want no sheen, or at least I don't require sheen. I don't want any shimmer. I want something very simple, very basic. Just a bit of shading if possible. They sent me a little sample bottle. I used it. I immediately loved it. Now this can be an iterative process, right? You can go back to them and say, no, a little darker, a little lighter, etc. In my case, it was perfect in one go. And that's because it's a fantastic ink. Now, having said that, your process may be different. You may have to go back and forth a couple times. And then there are 2 options. One option, at least used to be at the time, this is a couple of years ago, is that Diamine bottles the ink for you. And then you get a number of small bottles. If you want to sell the ink, that might be useful. It's not the most economical way to do it. The most economical way to do it is to get a 5-liter bottle, which they do. And you have to decant that into bottles of your choice if you want to sell it. They don't do labels because they only do labels on a very large scale. So you have to get your own labels, but that's all for selling. If you want a private ink that is just for you, right, then you say, I want this to be a private ink. That means that Diamine is not going to sell your ink to other people. And then you can just get a 5-liter bottle and you just put it in an empty ink bottle or whatever, an Nalgene bottle. It doesn't matter, right? But then that's your ink and you're not reselling it. In my case, the ink gets sent to Ackerman in 5-liter bottles. Ackerman puts it in their bottles and then we do things which are of no concern here. But they sell it, they do the shipping, and that's pretty much it. So that's a business relationship between me and Ackerman. But again, if it is just a private ink for you to use, then the 5-liter bottles are by far the most economical way to do it, because Diamine, very understandably, will charge you for the little bottles, will charge you for the bottling, and that all costs money, right? So at the end of the day, if it's just a matter of I just want to have my own personal ink, then that's how you do it. I hope this answered your question. This was another good question that I get once in a while. Again, expurgating a little bit. Do you have any experience with vintage pens? Because I know that you have no vintage pens in your personal collection. Surely there must be some sort of concrete experience which has led to that. Yeah, I have owned vintage pens, but I have a few issues with vintage pens. One is that they can be a bit fragile. Not always, but they can be a bit fragile. 2, often they're a little smaller. Not always. There are very big vintage pens. I'm very aware of that, but they can also be really quite expensive. And the third reason is a lot, not always, but a lot of vintage pens have very flexy nibs or pretty flexy nibs. I'm not really a flex writer, so that's lost on me. Analogy, the samurai with their samurai swords. They just called them swords. According to the culture of the samurai, you don't own a sword, you're just a caretaker. And then when you pass away or are killed in battle, or I guess that comes down to the same thing, or it's time for you to pass on that sword to, say, a child, you pass it on, right? You've only taken care of that sword as long as you retained it, and then you give it to someone else. In my mind, it's the same thing with pens, right? You take care of them for a while, and then you may pass them on to someone else, or sell them, or give them to a child or grandchild, whatever. Vintage pens have a certain personality to them, and for me, the maintenance is too much. The upkeep, I would be afraid to take them out to work because they may be a bit more fragile, and then what if they break and I'm holding on to some sort of heirloom? I don't want any of that. So these are some reasons. One, very pragmatic. They're often too small for me to use comfortably, and the other thing is they could be fragile, and I don't want that. There are certain people who love vintage pens, who love to restore them and take care of them. Let them have them, because they're attraction is lost on me a bit. I'd rather have someone to have them who really appreciates them. I hope that answers your question. And that's really just it. So the vintage pens typically don't really appeal to me. They just don't really appeal to me. And to some people, that's a mortal sin. And to some people, modern pens don't appeal to them. It's all fine. We're still friends. Final question. The aesthetics and workmanship put into handcrafted versus machine-tooled fountain pens. Basically, I'm looking for a reason to appreciate machine-tooled fountain pens more. It depends a bit on how you define things here. If by handcrafted you mean someone actually carving by hand a pen, well, that's one way of looking at handcrafted. If you put something on a lathe, that can also be handcrafted in my mind. Depends on the type of lathe. And if you make a pen and then do, for example, what Ryan Krusek does with putting scrimshaw in it, then I think that is even more handcrafted, even more personalized, or painting on a pen. So I'm not 100% sure what we are referring to when we say machine tooled, because I think many of the handmade pens are made on a lathe, which I think is tooling, right? Having said that, I think it really depends for me on the scale at which someone does something. If you have a factory where you have all kinds of machines making pens all day, well, I wouldn't call that a handcrafted pen. That doesn't mean that's not a nice pen, but it just means it's not handcrafted. If you deal with Uncle Dick, who makes pens on his lathe in the attic, then he uses a lathe, but I think you could call that a handcrafted pen. In my mind, that is a handcrafted pen because one person makes them, does all the work. And a lot of work goes into everything. Now, sometimes you have specific, I was just writing with this is a Pininfarina Senyo PF2. This actually requires a multi-axis lathe because it is not just rounded off. It has a flat facet, as you can see. Would we call that handmade? I don't know. Does a bit of work go into this? Yes, it does. Is it a nice pen? In my mind, it is. A very pleasant writer. So I think all those things you have to take into account. If you buy a Montblanc 149 or a Pelikan M1000, these are not handmade pens. Right? These are made in factories. I'm sorry, I can't sell that as a handmade pen. But is there anything wrong with that? People like those pens, right? So, for me, I keep coming back to the same argument in my mind, and that is buy what makes you happy. There are people, look at Kara's Customs. I don't own a Kara's Customs pen. They're not necessarily my type of pen, but they are machined pens that look really good. There are a number of companies like that produce pens like that, machined and metal parts and all that, that look really good, that have a very industrial look, which appeals to some people, doesn't appeal to other people. It's all fine. Again, we're still friends, right? That's the fun of fountain pens. There's something for everyone. So I think that's a very important choice for me, or a very important factor in the choice, I should say. Choose what you like and what makes you happy. And sometimes that may not make anyone else happy, and that's okay. It's perfectly fine. You can pick something that doesn't work for everyone, right? And I've reviewed pens that I thought were quite attractive that people found, based on the comments, quite ugly. It's okay. Some of those were one-man operations. It's okay. I find some pens that are sold by the thousand a day all over the world that I find hideous, but that people absolutely love. So, I'm sorry. Follow your heart, mate. Do what makes you happy. Do what makes you happy. And that's pretty much it. Because I think you can put beautiful workmanship into a machine-made pen. I think what some people do with kit pens that are often looked down on a bit is stunning and can lead to beautiful artwork. Again, Ryan Krusak, in my mind, one of the great artists of our time, and I'm very serious about that. When it comes to making pens, one of the great artists of our time started with kit pens. But then look at the scrimshaw he did on that. It's outstanding. But it was a kit pen, right? If a pen moves you, and after you buy it you can still pay the bills, then that's all you need to know. It moves you. Get it. As long as you can still pay the bills. I hope this was useful. Somewhat of an answer to your question. If I misunderstood you, just clarify the question. I'll come back to it with all pleasure. Right? Is that an English thing? That's Dutchism, sorry. I'll happily come back to it. I hope this was useful, and I'm glad to see you all later. Bye-bye. Click. Click. Okay, my mouse is not working.